Jeffrey, could you get the door? Okay. Welcome, everyone, to Fire, Water, and Other Queer Subjects. The Sea Gives Up the Dead by Molly Ogin, and Self-Portrait of Icarus as a Country on Fire by Jason Schneiderman. Give it up. My name is Greg Newton. I am the co-founder, along with my partner, Donnie Jokum, of the Bureau of General Services Queer Division, which is the space you are in right now. The Bureau is an independent, all-volunteer queer bookstore that Donnie and I founded in 2012, and that has been here at the LGBT Community Center since 2014. And today we're being helped out by our lovely volunteer, Jeffrey Archer. Thank you, Jeffrey. As an independent all-volunteer queer bookstore, we are dependent on both sales and donations to keep this machinery going in the service of our queer communities. So I'm going to pass it back for donations. If you're able to give something, we appreciate it. There's change in the bag, and there's also a QR code on the back for Venmo. Anyone online, if you'd like to give through Venmo, can do so at BGSQD. And we especially encourage you to make a donation if you know you won't be buying any books. But you're more than welcome to buy books and make a donation because we ain't making any money here. Our regular business hours are Wednesdays through Sundays from 1 to 7 p.m. We often stay open later on weeknights when we have events. And speaking of which, tomorrow, normally we're closed on Mondays, but we're doing a special event because it's June and we just can't do enough. We're going to be hosting Sarah Schulman for a reading and discussion of her latest book, The Fantasy and Necessity of Solidarity, which should be a really great event. So we're closed on Mondays, but we'll open at 5:30 for that, and the event will begin at 6. So please join us. It should be a really good event. If you're not already on our email list, you can sign up for that at the back of the room, and you'll get an email every other Monday about our upcoming events. And for those of you watching online, if you'd like to sign up for that newsletter, you can do that on our website, bgsqd.com. And before I introduce Molly and Jason, I'd like to read a land acknowledgement. So the Bureau acknowledges that our organization operates on the unceded land of the Munsee Lenape. We encourage you to join the Bureau in signing up to make a monthly donation to the American Indian Community Houses Mannahatta Fund. The Mannahatta Fund, according to its website, is an invitation to all settlers and non-native people who wish to acknowledge the legacy of theft and genocide that comprise the history of New York City and the United States. And you can find out more at mannahattafund.org. The Bureau also recognizes Palestinian liberation as a fundamental part of our collective queer liberation. And we encourage you to pick up one of our free little zines that we've made on why we feel it's important for queer people in particular to speak out in solidarity with Palestinians. So you can pick one of those up by the register or on the little Palestine table in the corner. Please check those out and share them widely. So let's get to it. Molly Ogin is a queer writer, educator, and monster enthusiast. Her debut collection, The Sea Gives Up the Dead, was selected by Carmen Maria Machado for the 2023 Grace Paley Prize and is out now with Red Hand Press. Jason Schneiderman, who's read at the Bureau 1 or 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times over the years, welcome back, is the author of 5 poetry collections, most recently Hold Me Tight, and including the forthcoming it's out now, it forthcame, Self-Portrait of Icarus as a Country on Fire. Like ours? Like our country, Jason?
Maybe our country is the country.
He edited the anthology Queer, A Reader for Writers. His poems and essays have appeared in numerous journals and anthologies. His awards include the Emily Dickinson Award and the She Stack Award and a Fulbright Fellowship. He is a longtime co-host of the podcast Painted Bride Quarterly. Slush Pile, that is one thing.
That's the whole title.
I see.
Painted Bride Quarterly Slush Pile.
Painted Bride Quarterly Slush Pile, and a guest host for The Slowdown. He is professor of English at the Borough of Manhattan Community College and teaches in the MFA program for writers at Warren Wilson College. Please give them both a very warm welcome.
I also have the distinction of having read at the BGSQD in I think at least 2 locations.
Yes.
I think I missed the first one, not by long. So I'm going to read about Desire from the new book, a story about writing. After the younger writer had refused the older writer, it seemed to the younger writer that both the proposition and the refusal were rather embarrassing events, not to be retold, and the younger writer, with all good intentions, decided to tell no one, particularly because the younger writer felt curiously protective of the older writer's reputation, and secretly, the younger writer feared that having refused the older writer was actually a sign of prudery, bourgeois morality, and overall non-bohemian boringness and boorishness. One night, many years later, the younger writer became drunk and told a group of same-age writers about the advance of the older writer and the resulting refusal. The younger writer, discreet in indiscretion, swore the other writers to secrecy, but upon hearing the confession, they laughed, as almost all of them had also been propositioned by the very same older writer, and while some of them had said yes, and some had said no, none of them felt that the story had anything close to the gravity that the younger writer felt it did. Realizing that his great secret was in fact of no weight, the distraught younger writer began to cry. When the same-age writers asked about his tears, the younger writer revealed how terrible it felt to have carried a secret of no importance, to which his same-age writer friends said, "Don't cry, young writer. This story makes us love you more than ever." A story about translation. What he said to me was quite simple, but I had to bring it into my language first. I went away from her by my own volition in one direction, he said. Or was the information contained in the choice of verb, the prefix, the tense, the gender? You left her, I said. But you told me you weren't together. No, he said. We were together, which was uncomplicated, the truth straightening everything out after so many tangled lies. And I will read one last poem before we get to Molly. Called Desire. That's something I can't find it. Here it is, Desire. I don't want a new phone or a new boy band, but thank you for the offer. It's a very nice phone, a very nice boy band. I never thought phones would be the kind of thing I thought about very much, or spent a lot of money acquiring, and I somehow thought that boy bands would age out of existence without replicating themselves in ever younger men. I thought boy bands were like Lawrence Welk, or telegrams, period pieces to run their course and then be discontinued, but no, they keep coming in unstable molecules of boys, brought together by the covalent bonds of managers, youth, desire, and money, and they keep spinning off into solo careers like so much smooth-bodied dandelion fluff carried on the celebrity winds of media. Please don't think I'm saying that I've had enough of phone calls or harmonies. I will want both as long as I'm alive. You could call me right now. I'd love to hear your voice. I just don't need a new phone. I just don't need a new boy band. I've fallen in love enough times in my life.
Okay, hi. I have to just say first off, I popped a blood vessel in my eye on the plane out here, so that is why I have like one bloody eye. I don't want you all to think I'm dying. So, So I'm going to read from my book, The Sea Gives Up the Dead. This is a book of queer fairy tales about death, and all the stories are too long to read in a couple of minutes, so I'm just going to read you the beginning of the story Clara Aguilera's Holy Lungs. Clara died, as all the others did, at God's hand. He sent an asteroid hurtling towards the world, and the world sent bombs to shoot it out of the sky, narrowly averting an age of ash and death. But of course, God had the last word. A little fragment of alien rock dropped into the Pacific, 20 miles from Catalina Island, cracking open the ocean floor. A great wave stretched up over the coast, bathing the port of Los Angeles in an eerie green light before it came crashing down. It swallowed up the shantytown at E Street, the Bradbury Building, the fiberglass whales of the Cabrillo Marine Aquarium, the pink castle in Orange County, and the ancient wood of Olvera Street with equanimity. Only two things truly left Los Angeles whole, and those were Clara Aguilera's holy body and Clara Aguilera's holy lungs. When Clara was alive, she was no one in particular. A freshman at Pedro High, chubby with baby fat and oily with puberty. In death, she became a sensation. Her body washed up on the new Oregon coast months after the disaster, only a mile from the refugee camp at Eugene. The lifeguard who waded in after her was the first to feel that something was wrong. An unusually warm wave rolled into his belly when he swam to Clara's side, heat seeping into him. The body drifted closer, giving him a glimpse of her white toes in the green water. He suddenly remembered a film he'd seen as a child, where a princess bathed in a lake and her gown billowed around her like wings, and when he caught hold of Clara's ankles, he half convinced himself she would smile, like the princess. She didn't look like a body. She was not bloated. She was not decayed. Her face was tipped up out of the foam, her eyes closed. But she was dead all the same, and he shook so badly that she slid out of his arms twice on the journey back to shore. Her picture swept across the nation, waiting to be claimed, and it worried everyone who saw it, little splinters of unease working under the skin. She didn't look dead, but they were assured she was. In some deep and animal way, this was troubling. A man in Georgia who had only glanced at her image on his phone woke up gasping from a dream where Oregon's Jane Doe lay beside him in his bed, softly breathing in and out. It wasn't a nightmare. He trembled with an unexplained tenderness, his chest aching with it, muscles drawn tight, making it difficult to exhale. The trouble grew as each day passed and she did not rot, the boundary between life and death growing less distinct, a border that seemed impossible when faced with the reality of her healthy skin, her unclouded eyes. She was distinguished from the living by the clean wound on her back, just under her ribs, and the empty hollows where her lungs should be. The coroner was without explanation. When he touched her, a sweet smell like crushed roses filled the air, and longing throbbed in his palms. Rigor mortis had not set in. She looked like a girl about to wake from sleep. 2 weeks after the incorruptible girl was rescued from the tide, Natalie Aguilera from Flagstaff identified the body as her younger sister. She had no papers to prove it, but she had some pictures of Clara on her phone, looking less than holy. Clara with overplucked brows, Clara squeezed into a salmon-colored dress, Clara sucking in her stomach fat. These pictures might have soothed the fevered interest that her corpse had sparked, except that a reporter hacked into Clara's cloud and found her final video, taken on her phone shortly before her death. In the video, the living Clara leaned out a window, camera shaking in her hands, unless it was the earth that shook beneath her, and captured the wave rolling in from the west. It still looked far away, but it was moving fast. Jesus, Clara said, and fumbled the phone, giving her audience a glimpse of her young face and wide eyes, full of awe and not yet fear. Jesus Christ, Clara said again, marveling, and the video ended. It was only an instant, but every heart ached at the sight of her disbelief, her childlike certainty that she could not be touched. The video traveled around the world, and grown men wept. Children went to school with little flickers of uncertainty worrying at their hearts. When Natalie began the drive from her home in Arizona to claim her sister's body, she was informed that a priest would meet her in Eugene to begin an unofficial inquiry. The Aguileras had been Catholic, and incorruptibility was unquestionably the province of the Catholic Church. At first, Natalie was angry, righteous fury sending her cheap car rattling 15 miles over the speed limit. Clara was not an angel. Clara had been a kid, brown and chubby, too articulate in the way of children with deep interests and not many friends, more passionate about the donuts after church than the Word of God. These were not memories of Clara at 14, but Clara when she was a child before Natalie moved away. It was the memory of Clara at 6 that had Natalie pulled over to the shoulder and yelling into the desolate scrub of the Colorado Plateau. She kicked viciously at a rock, shifting it only a little. The pain in her foot quieted her. She got back in the car. The truth was that Natalie had not known Clara very well, being 10 years older and not on excellent terms with her parents. She'd liked her sister, made sure to bring nice gifts at Christmas, had often complimented Clara's shining hair, a sensitive teenager's best feature, but she couldn't guess at Clara's interior life. With her foot throbbing on the gas pedal like an extra pulse, it occurred to Natalie that her sister could have been anyone at all, and she wouldn't know for sure. Thanks.
Feel free to take the mic. Okay, wait, I'm gonna ask some more. I'm a little thirsty. I'm gonna go assume that you're thirsty. But I think we had a first question for our conversation.
Yes.
And so I'll ask you first, which is, what does it mean to be writing queer literature right now?
Okay.
I should also say this is your question. Like, I didn't make this question, even though I'm the one asking it.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. So this is my first book, and it's been really, really bizarre to be in this like moment of like extreme like joy and gratitude when I'm also in this moment of extreme like fear and rage, and like trying to balance like the like to me like complete like delight of like, oh, I've written this queer book, like I get to like connect with queer readers and I get to like sort of feel like I'm doing this thing that I'm really proud of, and also like having to like deal with this immense like grief and like, again, rage at the same time. And so I think like for me, I feel like I'm really balanced between like horror and happiness. Yeah.
It's a beautiful question. Or a beautiful answer. It was a beautiful question. I'm responsible for neither. Yeah, I guess I have to answer now. I don't know. I mean, one of the things I really liked about your book, and I think that the story that you read kind of calls attention to it, was this sort of sense of displacement, right? The sister who dies and becomes a saint is sort of the main character, but really it's the sister, and what good does it do you that your sister's a saint, right? Like, that's like, okay, and what good does it do her? She's dead, right? That like there's this way in which everything that's happening sort of is outside of the people to whom it should be most important, right? That there's this kind of, there are these investments that are emotional and that sort of make people feel confused about their own centrality, right? That and I think this happens in a lot of her stories, which I thought was really beautiful. And I guess that's how I kind of feel. I feel like very sort of like, I'm not really sure where I am. Like everyone, there's no sort of more, like I talk about this all the time to my students, that there's sort of no Overton window left, right? That there was once upon a time this idea of sort of an acceptable range of opinion within the world, and that now, you know, you can sort of drop down any rabbit hole that you want to, and like, and so I feel sort of weirdly, like in a place like this, I feel very centered and happy, but like in sort of a general sense, I feel very decentered, and I don't really know who's looking at me. I don't know who I mean, I really do strongly, I mean, we were talking about like my Butler, right? I love Judith Butler's work, and I think that like the work that she does on gender, in which she talks about identity being a Heideggerian field of reception, right? That you're never only yourself, you're always being received within a kind of field. But now everyone kind of like, it used to be that you changed your field by moving, right? Like if you come to New York and you're at the Big Cup, that's one field, right? That's a different field than if you're in your high school cafeteria. And you could make that, you could be like, I'm gonna get to that, I'm gonna get to the Big Cup and it'll be fine. And now like it feels like that's like a virtual space or something. And so it's nice to be back, but that's kind of where I feel like very sort of disoriented.
Disoriented feels like exactly the mood for 2025. And like disoriented within like queer literature in 2025 as well. Okay, I've got a second question, which I think actually speaks to disorientation as well, which is, in my book, I feel like a lot of people have, so a lot of these stories are inspired by my family and my childhood, even though like supernatural things happen in them. And people have like, I think, heard that information and then taken it in surprising directions, where people will say something that like absolutely happened, or at least that I was told happened, like to like my grandfather, for example, and they'll go, well, this is obviously magical realism, or this is obviously fantasy. And I'm like, oh, but that one happened. Or then they'll take something that I made up, and then they'll go, well, that probably was inspired by real life. And I noticed that in your book, you also really play with like the speaker versus the poet, and there's a lot of like kind of rejecting like people looking at like the poems as being about you, but then they sort of seem to invite that at other times.
Right.
And so I'm wondering if there's like, what is like kind of the queer line between fact and fiction for you?
Yeah, I like it not to be clear. It's very protective. That like I think that in a lot of a long time ago, it's not the person who's in the poem about the younger writer, but he gave it was a World AIDS Day reading, and he prefaced, this is a long time ago. This is like 20 years ago, 24 years ago, and he prefaced his reading by saying, none of this is allegorical, none of this is metaphorical, everything in this is absolutely true. And then he immediately, after the reading, started hitting on me. And I was like, this is my boyfriend, who's also not allegorical, right? Right? But I thought it was a weird way to preface his reading. I mean, in one, because like it didn't sort of do the work that you would think it would do, right? That it didn't sort of like create a sort of space in which we all know what's real. But also that and I particularly like, sort of like questions like magical realism are like highly fraught in terms of like who gets to make that designation and who understands their lives. And obviously like a lot of the times when you're like, particularly when you're not a creative nonfiction writer, but you're working in the spaces of poetry and fiction, the pieces that are most implausible are usually the ones that actually happened. And we're often in the position of shifting things so that they sound realer because the real is impossible, but then the allegorical, I think, often has more truth. And I think that one of the things that like our culture suffers from is this, James Fry is back. We're live streaming. James Fry is back. And sort of being rehabilitated as like, it was so unfair when we canceled him. We didn't call it cancellation then, and like Oprah humiliated him and all this kind of stuff. But what I think James Fry indexed was that we don't understand fiction's value. That like people are watching The Matrix, and instead of being like, oh, this is an allegory for what it means to question the structures in which you live, like, what if we're in a simulation? It's like, no, we're not. Like, we're not in a simulation. And so, yeah, so I think that like within fiction and poetry, that ability to kind of have an open space where you don't have to pin down precisely what's real is both really protective for people who are doing that work, particularly because we do have, I mean, I don't know if you write memoir or not, but like,
no.
So there's a thing which memoir writers say to each other, which is, if they didn't want you to write that, maybe they should have been nicer. And we don't say that, right? Because we don't need that, right? Like we have this kind of space of play. And so I find it really protective. And I think it's really sad that our culture has sort of wanted to give that up, right? That our culture both reads, not allegorically, but literally. I mean, my boyfriend and I were watching The Substance, and I was saying like Elon Musk is watching this and being like, well, when I get The Substance, I won't make that mistake. It's like, no, that's not, right? No, that's not the lesson, right? No. So one is like this desire to read literally, but one is this, and the other is just like refusing, in refusing the value of fiction, is also this kind of insistence on truth and factuality kind of having this sort of pin-downable, knowable, permanent version. And that's kind of what I think that James Fry was, that like we couldn't handle it as a novel, but we could handle it as a memoir. And that precisely what we need from fiction was precisely what the culture surrendered.
Oh my God, I love that. I laughed when you said like you were a memoir, because like I really like, I find memoir like so horrifying. Like as I mean, it's great, I love memoir, other people's memoir. But like, I have tried, my girlfriend is an essayist, and she's constantly asking me like, hey, like this like crazy thing happened in your life, you could write an essay about that. And like, the sense of it being permanent, the sense of like my feelings about it being sort of like sort of cast in bronze, and like that feels like so so impossible to do that it is impossible for me to do it. And so like that space of like, this is like sort of true. This is like true enough. Or like this is true, but it doesn't necessarily like commit me to like your version of the truth.
Well, and also when I was reading, so the first story in your book of stories is about the 7 deaths within this family. And there were a number of points where I was like, oh, that happened to me. Like in a very literal, like real sense. And so it was fascinating to be going through this story. So, and as soon as I entered your book, and I don't know if this is something people tell you frequently, but like as soon as I entered your book, I was like, I've never seen anyone talk about this thing that actually happened to me.
Oh, man.
And it was kind of amazing.
So
Like the name change as a child, like this sort of like, right, like, okay, like that's a kind of death and a kind of rebirth and a kind of life, right? It was amazing.
Completely.
Yeah, it was exciting.
No, I had on both sides of my family like assimilation name changes, and on my mom's side, I found out like as an adult that I had a great uncle who didn't speak to my grandfather for 40 years because of the name change. Like that's absolutely like a death in the family. Yeah. And I really love that, like being able to recognize like parts of your experience, and that's a story where people have sort of called things magical realism or fantasy when I'm like, no, that one happened too.
Yeah, no, there's one poem that I have in this book, and it's funny because like people think that it's about a playwright writing a play, and then people ask me to see the play, and I'm like, no, it's totally made up. Like, there's no playwright, there's no play. It's just a story. And like, oh, but that part really happened. Oh, and that part really happened. And then I'm like, by the time I'm done with like all the stuff that really happened, I'm like, maybe I don't know, like, maybe I have a troubled relationship with reality.
I'm glad you brought that poem up because I love that poem so much. And actually, I think segues nicely into the next question that I have. Okay. This is a sad book. It's queer fairy tales about death, right? This is about a country on fire, and I would say it's also fairly sad. Like reading that book, reading that poem, like oh my god, that's such a like gut punch of a poem. And then like there were like so many parts in your book where I was like really laughing and like having a great time, and then there were other parts where I'm like I get the same like pit of dread in my stomach that I feel like reading the news. And so like
Yeah.
I know this is like a big question, but like what's the relationship in your work with like hope versus dread, or like despair versus like I don't know, hope again?
Yeah, I'm not a hopeful person. I'm very much, there's a poem called Catastrophist in the book, and I am very much a catastrophic thinker, and like as soon as anything happens, and again, like, right, like Butler and Cedric, right, this is the paranoid position, and the whole point of the paranoid position is that you won't suffer when the thing you're afraid of happens because you were prepared for it, but of course you still suffer. Like it doesn't matter, like even if you sort of like take out surprise, you're like, oh, that terrible thing happened, but I wasn't surprised. Like it's still terrible. And so I think that sort of like the end of my marriage, which was like really destabilizing, and this sort of like political climate and developments, which was incredibly destabilizing. I wish I were less prescient. Like, I mean, there were poems that I actually wouldn't read because I was like the re-education camp poem. I was like, oh, I can't wear, someone's wearing someone else's face as a mask and like giving a speech, and it's really gross, but it's also like kind of funny.
Deeply prescient.
Right, and I wish I were less prescient. But anyway, yeah, so I think that like for me, I mean, the other thing is Kafka, right? That like, there is this, I've always loved Kafka, and Kafka has the same question of like the magical realism, right? Like when Gregor Samsa is turned into a bug, is that real? Is that an allegory? Is that, you know, and I think that it sort of resists any sort of symbolic reading. If you're like, oh, this is like being a bug, like the whole thing falls apart, and so you have to kind of treat it on its own term, and kind of like, it's almost like a dream in which, you know, the question isn't like, oh, if you have a dream, you know, the person who is in your dream, where do you see it? It's where do you have that feeling in your life, right? Like the dream is an emotional recreation of the feeling. And so when I found out that Kafka during his life was considered very funny. That when he was reading the Metamorphosis at like literary events, people like literally fell out of their chairs laughing. Like that was like hysterically funny. And I did have this experience once where I took a course. There's another poem about this in the book about the course where we studied Franz Kafka and Frida Kahlo's work together, and we would come into class like really depressed about the Kafka and like really excited about the Kahlo. And the more you discuss the Kahlo communally, the more you just like want to like put your head on the table and cry. And the more you discuss the Kafka, the funnier it gets. Like you're like, oh my God, this is so fun. And so I think maybe there's some axis of despair and humor that's linked, and maybe in humor there's hope, because if you can still laugh, then at least there's a reason not to jump out the window.
Oh God, that reminds me of like the Bertolt Brecht epigram, like, will there be singing in the dark times? Yes, there will be singing about the dark times, but maybe there's laughing in the dark times, at the dark times.
Yeah, I mean, like my little brother is often trying to sort of like talk me out of my despair, and it just gets, I just end up on the floor, I go into a completely catatonic state. And so I think writing is really nice because it's a forward motion, right? Like at least, like there's something really beautiful about the way that like writing takes you forward in time in a way that canvas doesn't, right? Like if you're a painter, like you're sort of staying in this field, whereas if you're a writer, it sort of has to drag you into a kind of future.
I love that. Yeah, being dragged forward just by your readers, if nothing else. Yeah. That's lovely.
So how did you kind of like figure out the arc of the book? Like how did you decide like kind of the arc of the stories and that these stories kind of formed a coherent, because it formed such a beautiful coherent narrative. Like it was, and you really taught me how to read. Like as I kept going deeper into the book, I was like more familiar with the notes and it became such a recognizable style. I loved it. So like tell me about like planning that whole thing out and arcing that.
That is lovely, thank you so much. So I wrote most of the stories in the book for my MFA thesis, and after my MFA thesis, I kind of felt bad about it, and I was like, these are bad stories, it's a bad book. So I put it in a drawer and I did other stuff. I like became a teacher, I like wrote a bunch of screenplays and like a fiction podcast and stuff like that, and then came back to it like 8 years later, and I was like, I should look at that again, and looked at it and I was like, oh, no, it's not bad. Why did I? It's like such a weird like psychological game to be like, oh, like I felt so strongly like there was nothing worth keeping, and then I was like, oh no, actually there's stuff that I like, and so then I added a couple more stories and like kind of played around with the form of it at that point, and like what I sort of found looking at it was like even the stories that don't look like fairy tales are fairy tales, and like I wanted to sort of give you like a little breadcrumb trail from like the more like realistic stories into like the weirdest stories and like ending with an actual like Little Mermaid retelling. And so like
the Little Mermaid retelling is fantastic. Yeah.
Thank you. But like yeah, feeling like the teaching you how to read it, I think is me deliberately kind of taking like a literary reader by the hand and being like, come with me into genre, and then I'm gonna leave you with like an actual sea witch.
I'm gonna ask you the other writerly question that we don't ask each other enough, but what have you seen in the work that you didn't see before it was published? That once you were actually in the book and you're like, oh, you're like, oh, okay, yeah.
Oh, that is a fantastic question.
It always happens.
Okay, one like delightful discovery actually has been just in people's reactions, and there's a story in here about puppies, and a lot of the puppies die. This is not a spoiler; it happens really quickly. But a lot of people have been like had stronger reactions to that story than I thought. A lot of people are like, oh, I loved all the stories except that one I couldn't read, or that one I couldn't finish, or like it made me sick. I'm like, oh, I get it, puppies are tiny and cute and we love them. But a lot of the people who have like reached out to me to say they love that story are moms. And I'm like, that is such a cool thing. And so like, I feel like I've had so many like interesting conversations about like motherhood and like choosing motherhood or not choosing motherhood that have come out of like this story about a young woman who's like, I'm too terrified and inept to take care of these dying puppies. Yeah.
There's a website called Does the Dog Die?
Yes.
And for newbies, like if you have like a very sensitive dog lover in your household, yeah, we watched The Babadook, and that was really hard. I was watching it with a dog lover, and it was very hard for that.
I am a dog lover, just to know. But yes. Wait, can I turn the question back on you? What's a discovery that you had sharing this book with readers?
I have no idea how dark it was. After I read the book, I was like, oh, like there is no upward trajectory. There is like, this just gets worse. And so in terms of reading it, I almost, like I sort of have to read in reverse. Because if I read it forward, it's too dark. When I gave it to my dad, because I was just like, so this is where I was. It's not where I am, I'm okay. Don't worry. And he thanked me for that after he read it. He was like, thank you. But yeah, I did not realize quite the sort of darkness of the trajectory of the book. But I've always had a kind of like turn up at the end. Like I always pull back on the throttle and kind of go in an upward direction. And in this one, I did not realize that I hadn't until I was like, oh, okay.
Oh man.
So I was out in the world.
That's an amazing discovery to make given the title of your book.
Yeah. No, I thought the country would stop burning. When I wrote it, I thought the country would stop burning. Yeah. I mean, Sharon Olds, a million years ago, at a reading I went to, said that there's a kind of magic you can do, where you write the poem, where you write the thing you're afraid of, and then it doesn't happen. It worked for me for 20 years. Yeah.
Got it. Yep. Okay, well, a question I've been asking everyone I've been reading with is, do you have a favorite fairy tale?
So I knew about this question in advance, and I don't think I do. I'm sort of more like a myth person. I mean, Icarus, right? I'm more of like a myth person. Like when it comes to transformation, I'm much more of a kind of Ovid person than like a Hans Christian Andersen person. But I think that part of what I found exciting or relevant or resonant about mythology as opposed to fairy tales is that fairy tales often have a kind of good guy wins at the end quality to them. That like, I mean, Hans Christian Andersen, of course, has a very kind of Christian morality. If you're reading, I used to teach children's literature, and I would teach the Little Red Riding Hood, like the Charles Perrault from the 1600s. And at the end, like, and there's literally like a poem at the end that's like, don't be a whore. And my students were like, they're blaming her. Like one, they were like shocked that that was a rape. They were like, oh, I'm completely explicit. Like in 1600, or it's like 1680, it's like very explicit that Little Red Riding Hood has been raped because she shouldn't have talked to him and she did, and it's totally her fault. And my students were like really mad, and I was like, yeah, I mean, be mad, but like be mad at like, I don't know, the time period, be mad that this was like taught to kids. Like don't be mad that it exists, that I'm giving it to you. Like be mad about sort of what it indexes and then use that to kind of like see how things have changed in, I would think, positive ways. But that's sort of like the morality of the, or sort of like the Bruno Bettelheim sort of Freudian analysis of like the fairy tale. I mean, what I like about the Greek myths is that there's just no pretense that it isn't just all this kind of like realpolitik power dynamic, that, like everything that happens. I mean, it's part of my problem with Socrates, because Socrates is always saying that the myths are lies and that the gods are perfect, and that if the god, it's very Judeo-Christian, like, I mean, it's very kind of, like God is right, so we have to figure out what happened, but gods. So yeah, so I'm more of like a myth person, and of course, like, I'm not the only person obsessed with Icarus. Yeah, but what's your favorite fairy tale?
First of all, I love all of that and like that dragging of Hans Christian Andersen, which is totally fair. I feel like I should say that my favorite is The Little Mermaid, because I've got The Little Mermaid in here. And there's a lot of things I do love about The Little Mermaid, like just the transformation. I think like the ending in the Hans Christian Andersen is very, very Christian, right? She like decides she's going to earn her soul by doing good deeds, and then she's going to become an angel or something. But the like ways in which you also kind of think about like his biography, and like he had like this like queer like desire that like was really unrequited, and that like he sort of just like had like this high octane pining energy, I think really shows up in that story. And so I do really love that. But I feel like my answer is even more basic. It's Beauty and the Beast. I love Beauty and the Beast. And that one's just because I love a monster.
Well, that's the other thing about Beauty and the Beast, right? Is that everyone who loves Beauty and the Beast is totally bored as soon as he's a guy.
It's true.
The Beast part is hot and fun, and then it's like, oh, all right.
No.
Right. How did you end up getting into the other side of The Little Mermaid? Because like you have such a great, I mean, and I realized what was happening, like as the story was progressing, like I was like, oh, like okay, like I'm in the other, like how did that happen for you? Like what was that process?
So I was thinking this, like, as I said, a lot of these stories are about like my childhood or like family stories that I was told as a child, and I love The Little Mermaid a lot as a child. And so I was thinking about like, oh, like all of those like kind of little kid fantasies of like, I wish I were a mermaid, as opposed to like, you know, the mermaid who wishes she were a human. And so it's kind of just comes out of like, let's take that little kid desire seriously and see what happens if you put it there. And then like deciding that it wasn't just, if any of you were little kids in the 90s, perhaps you saw The Little Mermaid 2. I was like, I don't just want it to be The Little Mermaid 2. I want to have it be like next to the original Little Mermaid and sort of have like the two voiceless girls kind of orbiting each other. And then like there's the one voiceless girl, without spoiling the story too much, who the transformation she's trying to make is into this like heterosexual love story, and like she's betrayed by it. That happens in Hans Christian Andersen. And then there's this voiceless girl who chooses this other like monstrous queer love story, and like she ends up kind of being rewarded for it. And so just like putting those two things next to each other.
You actually, when you were answering that, you actually made me realize I do have a favorite fairy tale, which is the Oscar Wilde Happy Prince, which I cannot teach because I cry at the end of it, and my students are completely unmoved.
Oh my god.
And like it devastates. I literally cannot read the end of it without crying.
Oscar Wilde is my guy. I love him so much. I have a green carnation tattoo.
Oh. That's amazing. Yeah, the green carnation, for people who are not familiar, was the symbol of the, what was the term they used? Because before homophile, they were just sort of like aesthetes, I guess, aestheticists.
Aesthetes, I think inverts was also.
Inverts.
Yes. Okay, I think those are the questions we have. Any questions that y'all have? Yes.
Yeah, okay. This is particularly about reading your book, Molly, but obviously curious in anyone's thoughts. Actually, from the story you just read from, a line that really stood out to me was when one of the religious figures said, it's something like, science he happily took on faith. And it made me, it sort of had me free associating into this idea that often, at least for people perhaps who lack traditional religion like me, some of the most compelling explorations of faith have come from genre fiction. And it got, but then also I think that there are different kinds of faith, and perhaps people who lack traditional religion find and make their own faith in other places. And so I guess I'm just curious in, particularly being a genre writer, being queer writers, how, if and how faith shows up and interacts with your imaginative process.
Okay, I love this question. So in this book in particular, I think like a lot of it is like, so I grew up Catholic, right? And am now not Catholic. Well, technically I am, because they don't let you go. I've looked it up. You have to write a letter to a bishop, and they have to like. It's very bureaucratic. It's so bureaucratic.
You can get out?
You can get out if you are. They give you permission, but you have to like fill out a form. And so, according to the Catholic Church, I'm just a bad Catholic. But in like thinking about Catholicism, like there's just straight up magic in Catholicism, right? Like it is genre fiction. It's like you can have incorruptible bodies. Like there's this long tradition of like there is this body, it smells like roses, it doesn't rot, and then like you put it in like a glass case, and like people come to look at it and pray, and you charge them to like come in. It's like this whole like bureaucratic process. And so I was like, what happens if I like take all of that, like the magic of Catholicism, just as like this is a magical system that exists in this world, and then also like having like God kind of be this like background force who like does things like drop a meteor into the ocean, but like Natalie, the main character of that story, like still doesn't actually have any faith, and like can't find that faith because she's too aware that her sister was actually a person, and so wanting to sort of have faith like operate in the story as just like a framework that exists the same way like the framework of like mermaids exist in the Little Mermaid story?
I deeply respect faith, and had it once and do not anymore and sort of like miss it. And like some of my favorite writers, like George R. Hopkins, like, it's all about faith and it's so beautiful. I've written a lot about it in other books, but it didn't really enter into this one. But in my second book, there's a lot of theology in particular about fallen states.
Any other questions?
Should we read like another poem and another little excerpt, and then
Yeah,
we'll
let's
call
do
it a
that.
day? All right. Should I read the poem about the playwright?
Yes.
Alright, so it's okay. Dramaturgy. I'm writing a play about a commandant at Auschwitz who recognizes one of the Jewish prisoners as a famous poet. And as the commandant has poetic aspirations himself, he pulls the prisoner away from the work detail to receive poetry lessons from the celebrated Jewish writer. The bulk of the play is their discussions of poetry, which the poet is initially reluctant to have, the power differential being so stark, and though he flatters the commandant at first, when he begins to see his Nazi pupils' true devotion to the art, as well as his untrained and untapped talent, he goes to work in earnest, and at times they are both simply lovers of the German language, though the truth of their situation often interrupts. In the last act, the commandant is on trial for his crimes, and in the days before he is to be executed, he begs the poet to publish his work under his own name, the Nazis writing under the Jew's name, because as a Nazi, he feels his own name is disgraced, but he believes so strongly in poetry that it matters more to him that his work survive than that anyone know it was his work. The play is pulled entirely from my imagination, a careful rereading of Simon Wiesenthal's The Sunflower and the poetic ideas of Rilke and Goethe with a smattering of Nietzsche. In readings of the play, the commandant has seemed more noble than I had intended. In many ways, more noble than the Jew, because the Jew is suffering by no fault of his own, while the commandant is tortured by conscience and driven by a sense of poetic calling that separates him from the Germans around him. On the morning of the third workshop reading, I watched a video of two Russians on an ice dancing reality show performing as Jews in Auschwitz. I was sickened, even though I couldn't follow the pantomimed action, and I wondered if I was producing Holocaust kitsch myself. If my work was as disgusting as theirs, though I knew if I asked any of my team, they would reassure me that I am doing important work that rises to the level of art. Last night, during a break in a workshop of the play, I told the story of how my grandmother, upon learning that her entire family had died in the camps, had burned the photo albums of everyone she had loved. I have told that story many, many times without feeling much more than regret or sympathy, but this time I broke down crying and I couldn't stop. Everyone at the table came to comfort me and I felt ridiculous, but the only thing I could say was, it's time for us to go. This isn't a place we can live anymore. I left the studio embarrassed, and later that day, I resigned from the production. I don't think they believed that I was serious, and they'll expect me to show up at the next table reading. I won't. The play will go on, though I can have nothing more to do with it. This morning, after taking a shirt off the hanger, I looked in the mirror and realized I hadn't put it on. Without thinking, I had started packing my bag. And that's dated December 2016.
Oh my gosh. That, again, I got punched. Damn. Instead of reading another bit of the other one, I'm gonna read the only one that's short enough that I can read you the whole thing. I'm gonna read Honey from the Rock. When I was 6, I dreamed a bear broke a jar of honey over my head, and then I woke and it had really happened. I thought it had really happened. But the honey in the dream was like honey in a cartoon, sunny and thick, easily and cleanly licked off a comb or a paw. Real honey was different, and this is what pooled in my twin bed. It was warmer, thinner, stickier, familiar and strange in its unprocessed sweetness. The honey puddled over my eyes, which made blinking them open hard. I reached my hands up in the darkness and found my hair wet with it, honey tacky on my cheeks. I licked my lips and found it wasn't sweet after all, but it was familiar. I didn't recognize it, but knew I'd tasted it before. My sister was asleep on the other side of the room. I rolled out of bed and patted her awake. I wanted to ask where the jar went. I still have the scar. It's a silver line that snakes along the curve of one eyebrow. I wasn't even hurt. Head wounds just bleed a lot. I probably should have gotten stitches, but my dad didn't trust doctors. He wrapped me up in some gauze and tape from the first aid kit, and in a few days I was fine. When I tell people, they usually think something must have happened. They imagine my parents standing over me with clenched fists, the sharp angles of my mother's wedding ring catching the light from the street lamp, or they imagine my sister folding a pocket knife under her pillow and pretending to sleep, the cat sinking her fangs into me, some sicko sliding out the window with a hammer in his hand. I don't think so, though. I think I just split open, like my head was an overripe fruit, tearing under some internal pressure. Bodies are weird like that, aren't they? Bizarre and fragile in ways we don't expect. Why shouldn't people sometimes burst open? Stranger things have happened. Only children completely trust their foundations, their homes, their parents, their Melanie skulls. Well, children and idiots, I guess. Everyone else knows bedrock erodes. Crevices yawn open in lives all the time. Sometimes I'll spoon honey into my tea and remember about those invisible plate tectonics. But the tea is always sweet on my tongue.
Greg, do you want the last word, or should we just thank everyone for coming?
You have the last word.
Okay. Thank you for coming. My Hutchison will sign them.
Please.
Sweet, thank you guys. Thank you online.